Thank you, Craig. I always forget that. And we're going to be looking at the first case in the Bible of women basically demanding legal rights within the Jewish tradition. Now, according to Rashi, these are the daughters of Tzalafchad. And according to Rashi, this takes place at the 40th year in the wandering in the wilderness, because up until now, they haven't had any land to distribute. And I'll just take us back to remind you, after the scouts, the spies were sent in by Moses, and they brought back the report. 10 of the scouts said, it is a beautiful land, but it's got giants there and we can't win. Let's go back to Egypt. And 2 of the scouts, and you know their names, right? I see Mark's lips moving, but
Joshua and Caleb.
right?
Yeah.
Caleb and Joshua. Good. I would just want to make sure you guys continue to learn in all of your Torah study. Caleb and Joshua say, no, we can do it. With God's help, we will do it. But the people panic. And so the generation of the wilderness are condemned to live out their life and their death within the Sinai Peninsula. And then accordingly, every night, a certain amount of them, about 15,000, according to tradition, die every night until by the end, the whole generation is dead except for Joshua and Caleb. That includes, of course, Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. They will all die in the Sinai before getting there. And so the whole law about distribution of the property, of the territory of Eretz Yisrael is only theoretical until they get there, right? And until they conquer it. You know, it's not enough to just get there. They also have to control the land. It's one of those real interesting things that we don't often think about. But when God said, this is the holy land, I give it to you, well, he gave it to us, but we had to take it. You know, it's not like God said, wait, I'll clear all the tribes out and I'll make it clean of everyone, and then you'll go in and you'll settle it. Basically, God said, it's all yours. Here's the deed. Now go make war and take the property. So it took about 200 and 250 years for the final conquering of Jerusalem by David. So from Joshua, around the year 1250, let's say, to the year 1000 BCE, when David took Jerusalem, 1003 or somewhere in there. That 250 years is how long it took to take it all. Then all the tribes had their property. So over that period of time, different tribes got settled, right? But not all of them. It took time to get them all settled in the property. It took time to get rid of the Canaanite tribes. Then we had the Philistines. We were making war against the Philistines for quite a while. So we're right at the 40th year, according to Rashi. And the daughters of Tzalafchad bring a case to Moses. And they said, you've distributed the land and you've said that only sons inherit. But our father died without sons and he has 5 daughters. It's not right that our father's name should be erased from Israel. His inheritance should live on through us. Moses doesn't know the answer. According again to Rashi, who quotes the Midrash, Moses forgot. God had told him, but Moses forgot. So he goes to God, and God says, yeah, of course, listen to the daughters of Tzlafchad. So we're going to look at Dir Shuni, at a Dir Shuni take on the daughters of Tzlafchad, and see how one of them who wrote this midrash frames it. Any questions before we plunge in? No? Okay. Then let's see. We can get to the text. Here we are. Okay. So we're in the book of Numbers, and the word, obviously, it's not an easy name, Tzlafchad. It's not a name that we name our children. I've never heard of anyone named Tzlafchad, even in Israel. There are certain names that just didn't make it over time. You can see Hefer also didn't seem to make it. Gilead made it. But Machir, we do once in a while hear that name. And then with the girls' names, the daughters, Noah is the name that Rabbi Pomerantz gave to her third child. It usually is spelled in modern Hebrew, modern English without the H, to differentiate it from Noach, which is spelled with the H. Tirza is very often used. There are some Milkas I've heard. Hogla, not so much. Machla, there are a few, but it's not common. Yes, Joni.
Your voice is echoing in somebody. I think everybody should.
Okay, if everyone could mute until you're ready to talk, we're getting a little bit of an echo. If you could. Okay. So the only one that isn't going to mute is Bubbie, because she has the pole position in reading.
Okay, where do you want me to skip the names?
Yeah, you can skip the names. I'll be gentle tonight.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. They stood before Moses, Eleazar the priest, the chieftains, and the whole assembly at the entrance of the tent of meeting. And they said, our father died in the wilderness. He was not one of the faction, Korah's faction, which he banded together against Adonai, but died for his own sin, and he has left no sons. Let not our father's name be lost to his clan just because he had no son. Give us a holding among our father's kinsmen.
Okay, so take a pause there for a moment. So let's unpack this little paragraph. So first of all, look to see who the high priest is. It's not Aaron. That's how Rashi takes it, that this is after the death of Aaron. It's Aaron's son, Eleazar. So from that, Rashi takes the Midrash, which says that Aaron had died, right? And he dies before Moses. So this is that small little interim period in the 40th year after Aaron had died and before Moses died. So they stood before Moses, before the high priest, the chieftains, that means the heads of the tribes, the whole assembly at the entrance of the tent of meeting. So you have to imagine these 5 women are standing in the holiest of holy places in front of the entire leadership of the Jewish people at that time. Right? Now, we don't know, did they just go there and walk to that place and say, hey, we got a problem. We have a case that we want to bring before you. Or did they go first to some of the lower level authorities, heads of the tribe maybe? Did they go to their tribal leaders first? Did they talk to other women? Did they talk to their mother? How did they decide to have the chutzpah to go to this place in that very special spot? We have to imagine, remember, Midrash wants us to imagine real people, real living people. And you have to imagine it's like if the women for reproductive rights suddenly showed up one day at the White House, at Congress, let's say, with the entire joint session of Congress and the president and the Supreme Court and the Joint Chiefs of Staff all in attendance, and they suddenly came there and said, we got a case. We want your ruling now. I mean, it would never happen. It doesn't happen that way in real life. There had to be a process that brought them to that spot. They must have at least talked to their friends. They must have at least talked to the mothers around them. They had to have imagined, what is the case? How do we best shape it? What argument can we make? And look at the argument they make. It's not fair to our daddy, right? Not that it's not fair to us, because who would have listened if the case was, we're women, we have the rights equal to men? No one would have bought that, right? 3,000 years ago. Some people still don't buy it today. So they had to think about, how do we present our case? If you remember, when Justice Ginsburg first became famous for women's rights, she appeared before the Supreme Court, and the case she brought was a man, a widow or a widower, who was claiming the right to Social Security for his children because his wife had died. And in the law, it said only women, widows, could claim that right. She chose that case because she knew that the all-male court would respond to that plea more than bringing a woman's case. It was meant to be an incremental step. And that's what happens here. They've shaped the case so that it best reflects what they believe the men will respond to. Because there are no women in this assembly outside of them, right? This isn't an all-male group. And they're standing in an all-male place. The Mishkan, the tabernacle, totally run by men. Kohanim, Leviim, they were all men. So it took a lot for them to get there. Maybe they've been working on this for a few years. Maybe they've been talking, and maybe they've had meetings in their tents, just like people have done today in order to get grassroots support. Maybe they have the support of the women in their tribe, or maybe they have it beyond their tribe. Maybe they have the support of the mothers, and maybe they've already lobbied some of the men. We don't know any of this, but we have to imagine this didn't just happen one day that they showed up. Any comments?
I think they had to have been exceptionally gifted to talk to these men. Because if you go before the Supreme Court now, I don't know how far you'll get. You know, we do have women on there, yes, but I think the majority of the men still rule. There are a few that would not vote for a woman to be breaking this rule. I think it's wonderful it happened, but they had to be very good spokespersons, very strong.
Right.
And have made maybe connections, as you say, along the path.
Well, and
Just like when you're trying to get a divorce these days, you know,
right.
Right? How hard that is. Here they want all of their family to get what they feel is coming to them because there's no son.
Right.
No brother. No, wow.
And we also have to imagine they might have not been the first to do this, meaning to think of it, but they're the best case. You know, you pick your cases that are the most powerful case. Here are 5 daughters and no sons. There had to be other families where there were only daughters and the father had died of natural causes. Because if you look, when they talk about their father, they make it clear he was not a rebel, right? He was not part of Korach's group that rebelled. He supported Moses and God. he was not part of that. He died of his own sin, meaning he died of his own illness himself, died like anybody did. So they also added that little parentheses, he did nothing wrong. He didn't deserve to have his name taken away. So they make their case, and you almost have to imagine that some of the women who were working on this looked around and said, we think that Salafchad's daughters are the best case. And they probably were, at least one of them was a great spokesperson, because one of them spoke up. They didn't all in unison speak. Whoever it was that spoke was that kind of person who, like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who had commanding presence and could speak in front of this group without trembling. Any other comments before we go to the Midrash? Okay. So, Bubbie, are you reading, or should we go on to?
I'll read. I'm
Okay.
fine. Yeah. Moses brought their case before Adonai, and Adonai said to Moses, the plea of the whole
Salafchad, right?
Daughters is just right. Ken, you should give them a hereditary holding among their father's kinsmen, transfer their father's share to them.
Okay, so they're going to base, you can see that this Midrash, which was written, I didn't even write her name. It must be, I thought I had her name here. I don't remember it now. Let me look. Is it at the bottom? How could I have done that? I'll have to check to see what her name was. I'm sorry. I apologize to her. I don't remember her name offhand. But you see it says Ken. Ken in Hebrew, right? Those of you who know Hebrew or went to Hebrew school, you know that Ken is yes and lo is no. Ken. Ken Mora, yes, teacher, you might have had to say in class. So she's going to base it on it, because in Hebrew it says the daughters of Salafchad's case is Ken. It is Ken. It is, you can translate that as, it is yes. The answer is yes. It is just. It is right. It's the right one. Okay, so she's going to use that in writing this Midrash. Okay, let's go on.
Why were they referred to first as the daughters of Zelophehad and only afterward by their own names? Because of the Sel and Pakad shadow and fear that was in them at first.
Okay, let's hold for a second. So she's taking apart the name Salafchad. Starts with Sel, which is shadow, and Pachad, which is fear. She notices, the Midrashist notices, that the two words appear in the name, the shadow of fear, or shadow and fear. So she begins by saying, right, where is it? Here we are. That Sel, right, and Pachad, shadow and fear, was in them at first. So their father's name reflects, in effect, what they felt at first. They were afraid. They were in the shadow of fear. And as she says, they dwelled in their father's shadow, and they were afraid to raise their heads. Right? As many women would be, and still are, right? In many societies around the world. Okay. Any questions about that? What you're seeing here again is the way Midrash works. And I hope if there's one thing you take away from these classes, it's that when you read a Midrash, you don't just read the words, but you try to imagine the people that are behind the story and what they're going through, and what the Midrashist wants you to imagine. because that's what the midrash, that's what she's doing here. She's imagining these young women, and she looks and sees the father's name, and she's saying, look, this text is saying these women at first were afraid. They were in their father's shadow. They didn't believe it was their right to speak up. Right? So how did they get the strength to do it? And that's the beginning of this midrash. So let's finish this paragraph, Bubbie.
I just wanted to comment. Isn't it strange that he happened to have that name?
Well,
And the-
it depends if you believe it's strange or that it's the way that God made it so that we would understand what they were going through. That is, people who write midrash, ancient people and modern, have this sense that everything in the text is there for a reason. And we have the right to mine anything in the text. If it's really there, we can see it and we can show why we can use it. So we can say it was coincidental. His name happened to be Tzalafchat and has nothing to do with the women. But isn't it more interesting to think, who these women were? And it is natural to think that they were afraid and they were in their father's shadow. I mean, let's think about Tevye. What did it take for Tzeitel? You all know the story in the musical. What did it take for Tzeitel to confront their father that she didn't want to marry Laser Wolf? Right? That was 150 years ago. And she was in the shadow. She was afraid. Her, a model was afraid to confront Tevye. I mean, that was the way it was. The patriarchs, some of us remember grandparents who were like that, whose families lived in their shadow or were afraid to confront them. So yeah, it's a way of drawing out this aspect of how they got the strength to confront all of the men in authority. Does that answer, Bubbie?
Well, I mean, what if his name had been Abraham?
Well, then we would have a different midrash and probably a different story.
That's what I was thinking.
Well, and you know that Abraham's name means father of nations.
Okay.
So that's Abraham's name was used for, in effect, Isaac would then continue on as they would become the generation that created nations. Okay.
Okay. All right. At first, they dwelled in their father's shadow and feared to raise their heads. Once they drew near to one another, they were empowered and known by their own names, as it is written. And the daughters of Zelophehad drew near, and these are his daughters' names.
Okay. So he's using this. They drew near, right? Go back up here to the sentence. They stood before Moses, right? So they take that. Came forward. Do you see it?
Mhm.
The daughters of Tzalafchad came forward. That is the same. It's lahagish, still used today, to come near, to draw forward, hagasha. So they came forward. Who did they come forward to? The Midrash is saying they came forward to each other. Right? Where did they gain their strength? From sisterhood. That's for our co-leader of the sisterhood. They drew near to the sisterhood, each other, and got strength to speak. And so that's the first part of the midrash, right? So she explains in the midrash how the text helps us understand how they were able to figure out and have the strength to make this happen. So now we move on. Now here we have another aspect of this. You're going to have this name, Tanot. Some of you that studied with me, I think last year, I used the Midrash of Jephthah's daughter. In the book of Judges, there is one of the judges whose name is Jephthah, who's a very stupid man. He's a wonderful general, but he's a stupid man. And he makes a pledge. And he says, if God delivers the enemy into my hands, I will sacrifice the first thing that comes out of my house when I come home.
Right. I remember that.
The first thing that comes out of his house is his daughter. And he says, I'm going to sacrifice you because I swore an oath to God. And according to the story, he does slaughter his daughter. It's a terrible story. She dies a virgin. It says that the virgins of the society looked to her almost as a patron saint in those days. She doesn't have a name. There's no name. So in a previous midrash, one of the writers in Dir Shuni took from the text and took the name Tanot, which means it's a verb to complain or to put a plea before a court. Hatana is a plea before a court, litanot. And the word tanot appears, litanot, appears in the description of Yiftah's daughter, of Jethro's daughter. So she gets named in the Midrash, Tanot. And what does Tanot do in the Midrash? Because she's dead. She's in the Olam Haba, in the next world, and she runs a yeshiva for women. And anytime there's a case that involves women, she pleads the case before God. Okay? So now we have to imagine we're in the Olam Haba, we're in the celestial
Is
yeshiva.
that, is that the Der Shuni description, or that court that Tanot runs, is that's mentioned somewhere else?
Nope, it's their invention. They
Oh.
take it out of the text.
Wow.
They create this notion. And of course, you have in the Midrash that God has courts up there. We know it from the book of Job, don't we? Right? The Satan, who is the prosecuting attorney, accuses God. He says, of course, Job loves you. You've given him wives and children and money and cattle, and he's famous. Of course he loves you. Put him to the test, he'll curse you and die. So God says, okay, you've made your case. Here's Job. The only thing you can't do is kill him. Do whatever you want. And that's the book of Job. So we have stories of the celestial court. There's a famous Yiddish story, if not higher, written by Shalom Aleichem, about a court that's expecting, the court is expecting one of the great tzaddikim of the world to come. Their soul is about to ascend, and they're all, a titter in the other world to come. So there are a lot of stories about in the Midrash, in the folklore, even in the Bible, that refer to this notion of God having a court in the heaven. But the idea of a woman's court, of a woman's yeshiva, well, that is Dir Shuni. They've derived that from text. Is that okay? Got it? So Tanot asked God, and Mark, while you're off, why don't you take over as reader now? Bubbie, thank you.
Tanot asked God, if Zelophehad's daughter spoke the truth, why didn't you write that in your Torah in the first place? For after all, you are truth and your Torah is truth, and your word endures forever. God answered, truth will grow from the ground.
So right, Tanot accuses God and says, look, why did you make them plea? That's not fair. Why did you do that? They shouldn't have had to plead. It should have been in the text. Should have been part of the law. And
That's
God answers with this quote from Psalm saying, truth will grow from the ground, meaning the law will come from grassroots. The people will help expound the law. Now that's pretty important because the whole oral law grows from cases. If you read in the Talmud, it grows from cases that are brought to the rabbis and the courts. That's how the oral law grew. It grew from the ground. God doesn't explain everything. The laws get fleshed out by the groundswell, by the root, by grassroots.
Hmm.
Okay, so let's move on.
Tanot asked, but is it not written, God's Torah is whole? God answered her, I already wrote in my Torah, be wholehearted with God your Lord. And once more I wrote, walk before me and be wholehearted. There is truth that descends from on high, and there is truth that grows from below. Blessed is the generation in which truth from above meets truth from below. And this is what Scripture means when it says, truth will grow from the ground and justice look down from heaven.
So this is a statement here. You have this Tanot having this dialogue with God and accusing God basically and saying, I don't get it, God. Why didn't you just give this law? And God's saying there are two kinds of truth. There's truth from on high, but there's truth from down below. And blessed is the generation where the truth of the high meets the low. Right? And that's why it says in the book of Psalms, truth will grow from the ground and justice look down from the heaven. Right? All of these are using texts that are part of the Tanakh in creative ways in order to kind of say that we shouldn't think that only truth comes from the Word of God.
That's
Truth
great.
also comes from average people saying important things. And it all mixes together if we allow it, which means you can't shut yourself off from the people and just say it's only God's word that we listen to.
I haven't read it yet. Are they implying that when the issue came up, when did the conversation between Tanot and Adonai take place? When Moshe went to ask the question. So was Tanot kind of making the case on behalf of the daughters, or is that completely separate?
No, Tanot would have been already in the conquest of the land of Canaan. So she would have lived with the daughters of Tzalafchad. She would have lived, in the next generation, or two generations after. She would have lived maybe 100 years after the daughters. But she's going to God and she's giving God the business. She's saying, look, God, what's going on here? I'm reading the stories of the Torah that you gave us, right? I saw the stories. I know the stories when I was down there. Now I'm up here. I got some questions for you.
That's
Let's
great.
Let's talk, God. See, one of the interesting things about the Dir Shuni approach is in the world to come, in the Olam Haba, the women are equal to God. Women can confront just like Satan can. The women, in this case, Tanot, representing the women, can confront God. And God has to answer. And he does. Okay. So this is the third part of the Midrash that I brought. Again, I'm sorry I don't have her name. It said, there's a statement that's an important statement. Redemption will come when you quote B'Shem Omro, in the name of the one who wrote it, which is to say, you know, when I quoted Rabbi Yitzhak Zweig in my last sermon, if I had just used that paragraph without quoting him, that means that I didn't help redemption coming. It also means that I plagiarized. But the reality is that you're supposed to quote the person that wrote it if you know who wrote it and if you're taking a direct quote, right? So redemption comes when you quote in the person's name. All right, so I'm sorry again, and here we go for number 3. Who would like, maybe we'll get to, is Karen still on? She want
Yeah, I'm here. I'm here. I'll read.
Gail. Okay, after that, Karen?
The cynics of the time said Zelophehad's daughters are hypocrites. They said they're doing this for their own power, their own prosperity, to make themselves men's equals when it comes to inheritance. They aren't doing this for the sake of heaven. That is why the Torah says, can,
Right.
rightly, as it is, as in honest, canute, and rightly, as in correct, nachon. They act for their own power. They act for their own prosperity. For their prosperity, they act to make themselves men's equals. When it comes to inheritance, they act for the sake of heaven.
Okay, so they're not backing down. They're not, these people come and say they're hypocrites, and they say, yeah, we do act for our own power. We do act for our own prosperity. We do act to make ourselves men's equals when it comes to inheritance, and we act for the sake of heaven. And we're not apologizing. It's a very modern approach, right? You can't imagine they would have said something like that, but you can imagine women today, right? Some of the women right on this in this session who might say something like that, right? We're saying, of course, why men do that? Why wouldn't women do that? Why shouldn't we act for our own power? Why shouldn't we act for our own prosperity? What's wrong with that? What's wrong to say we're all equal? And what's wrong with saying it's all for the sake of heaven? They can all be true at the same time. Okay, so let's stop share for a minute. So what do you think of these 3 midrashim about the daughters of Tzalafchad and what it tells us about our world today and about your world? Yes, Gail.
So my first thought is the women, and I'm only speaking out of, I'm not really knowledgeable, only from some people that I know. The women that are really religious very often have a back seat. You know, they're not in charge. And I'm thinking of, well, let's go out of our religion and we look at people who are wearing scarves, or they're never allowed to take them off. Or just like the religious women wear a shadel. Why? Why can't they just be natural? So where did that come from? Is this all part of how a woman was seen through God's eyes? I don't know.
No, it was how it was seen through, how women were seen through men's eyes.
Control.
It's the issue, as Joni just said, of control. Is how do you control women so they don't do what these daughters of Tzalafchad did in this midrash? Because look what happens when you let a woman make a case before the Supreme Court. The next thing you know, she's on the Supreme Court. That's what happens. It's the same thing that happens when you let a Jew into Harvard. Other Jews get into Harvard. And then pretty soon you got too many Jews in Harvard. And now you're being inundated with Jews. And so you want to try and restrict Jews. And the same is true with women. You start worrying about women's rights because they have too many rights. So you start attacking the rights of women in the courts. And if you get a court that's willing to support that, as we have now in the Supreme Court, you start pulling rights away from women. And now in Alabama, you take away even more rights. They can't even get fertility treatments.
Yet
Right?
our basic documents are the value of our bodies, of our personhood. So why didn't it start right there? Where did this division come from?
It's how you read it. You have to remember, look, how was the United States is one of the greatest inventions in the world as a nation. And yet it started by saying all men are created equal, and it was a lie.
Right.
Even that statement was a lie. Forget about the women.
Right.
All men were not created equal when this country was founded. Not even all white men. Right? Forget about Native Americans and Africans and all the others. You know, there were only landholders were created equal at the beginning. But it was an ideal, an aspirational ideal. So in Jewish tradition, the aspirational ideal is everyone is created in the image of God.
Aspirational. Right.
It's aspirational. And for some, they resist that aspiration. And there are some of our Jewish people who continue to resist that and to say, no, God created Adam first. Eve is from the rib. Eve is meant to be a secondary figure. She must be kept in her place. And we must always maintain that balance of power. And the power has to be held by the men. And of course, there's the legend of Lilith, which feeds into that, because Lilith was the equal with Adam, according to the legend, and she confronted Adam, and God sided with Adam, and Eve was created to be secondary to Adam, and Lilith became a demon of the night. Because what else? How could men imagine a powerful woman other than a demon that snatches the breath of babies out of their cribs? And and if you look at why the Iranians or fundamentalist Muslims and Saudi Arabia until recently didn't allow women to drive by themselves, and now they can. They're starting to move in the modern direction. But all of this, didn't really begin to change substantially until about 300 years ago in the West. It had made different changes over different times. In the Greek society, Greek women citizens, at least at certain level, were in many ways close to equal to men, though they didn't serve in their parliament. In Rome, women have power. Sarah has power in our Bible. But none of it is equal. But in today's world, the women writing Midrash are saying, we're going to use the same texts to show the equality of women and the power of women. And that's why Dear Shuni is so important as a real fundamental beginning of Jewish texts. Now, of course, they're not accepted by the Orthodox, the Haredi community. They're not accepted by the fundamentalist Hasidic communities, but they are accepted by modern Orthodox.
They are?
Yeah, modern Orthodox have no problem. Modern Orthodox has, if you've ever been to Shira Hadashah, I don't know how many, I know Mark and Karen have, in Jerusalem. Shira Hadashah is a modern Orthodox synagogue, which has a mechitza, but women lead worship. Women read from the Torah. Women are called to the Torah. They do it by opening the mechitza so that men and women can then see the Torah together. But they still have this flimsy, see-through mechitza because that's the halacha. And there are places, there used to be a synagogue. One of the biggest Orthodox synagogues in the United States is in Baltimore. Mitch Wahlberg was the rabbi. And they used to have a 12-inch glass mechitza in the middle of the main sanctuary. And families would sit together. The wife would be on one side of this little glass thing and the husband on the other, and the kids on either side. And no one made any statement about it. And then the Orthodox community started saying, wait a minute, that's not really right. So they had to raise it a few inches. There's a lot of modern Orthodox places, including those that are ordaining women. And some of those women are writing these midrashim, right? These are women who have learned text, and they are capable, and they are making the statement that right there in the holy text, in our tradition, is the ability to draw out this notion of women being equal in every aspect. Again, this may take 100 or 200 years to permeate parts of our community, but everything is very slow. We were talking before we started, when Marty was talking about Rosie the Riveter, how recent it is that women got the vote in America, and how recently it was that women started demanding other rights after World War II, and how long it took to have the Equal Rights Amendment, which was defeated, right? Ultimately was not validated, but yet has been fought through. So there's a lot that's still going on, not just in the Jewish community or in the Catholic Church, but in America, in the prime democracy in the world. This is a process, and our children and their children and their children hopefully will continue to fight it and move the arrow further and further until we do find some sense of equality, not just with women, but with all human beings created in the image of God. Comments?
I was just I think the reflecting on this midrash, how brilliant it really is to draw on some of the text to make two kind of additional powerful points, or bring up some possibilities. One is the celestial court that's run by women, that exists, and that a conversation then takes place, with Adonai about this case. That's really beautiful. And the other one is that there's interpretation that comes from the ground up, so that the Torah can be interpreted and should be. And so those are two cases that support, to me, the daughters of Zelophehad's case, but it also makes a bigger statement about the role of women. So I love
Good.
that.
And remember, what's interesting about Tanot and her court, you have to imagine, because the rabbis never imagined this, they imagined that Avraham Avinu and Yitzhak and Yaakov and David, and they were all up there, and they all hobnobbed with God. They never imagined Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah up there, or Devorah, or Miriam. But Tanot's court is filled with all those women, right? And all those women are up there, and Beruria is up there from the Talmud. And, you have to imagine that this court is filled with all these Ruth Bader Ginsburg people. I'm just saying, these really bright, powerful, strong women, and they're in this one court, and they're saying, let's discuss this case. And it's the one who represents them, because one person has to argue the case before the court, is Tanot, who was Jephthah's daughter, who was sacrificed by a stupid father. And I'm saying stupid because the rabbis in the Midrash and the Talmud criticize him and say he could have annulled his vow. What's wrong with him? There was a priest, a high priest. Go to the high priest, he'll annul the vow. It was an illegitimate vow, and it was a mistaken vow, and there were all kinds of means. And as father, he himself could have annulled the vow. And he, according to the Midrash, said, no, I made a vow. God was good, made the victory. We're going through with it. And was willing to kill his daughter over that. So she's like this ultimate victim who will not be a victim in the next world. In the next world, she's the champion of all women. Right? She never got married. She never had children. She never was able to live a life beyond a young virgin, and was killed by this father, this brutal man. But she is the representative of all these great women who appears before God, according to the Dear Shuni approach toward Midrash. Something that never would have happened had these women not started writing Midrash. And as I've told many of you in other places, both volumes of Midrash are now on Sepharia. Most of it is still in Hebrew. And as you know, there's still one volume that's been published in English. And if you are interested, you should buy it and read through it. And you can look at it. And if if you're reading one and you don't, and in it, in the English volume, there's an explanation right after the Midrash that takes you through how the Midrashic writer used the text and talks you through it.
Hmm.
So
What's the name?
it's called Dear Shuni, Dirshuni. It's edited by Tamar Biala. I'll show you her name because she's in the next Midrash, which we probably won't get to today. Here she is, here, Tamar Biala.
Hmm.
She's the editor of it. She's one of the driving forces behind the whole, not just Dear Shuni, but this whole movement of trying to think about the whole women impact into holy text. There's another group called Savara and another group called Torah Ta. The Torah Ta group is actually rewriting the Torah in feminine Hebrew.
Oh.
That's why it's called Torah Ta.
Hmm.
The ending, right, is a feminine ending. Torah is already a feminine ending, but because Torah is associated with men, they added the final Torah Ta, which is an Aramaic way of writing it, to make it a feminization of the word Torah. So they've changed all the names. Moshe is Masha. I mean, they've made them feminized. Now, I've read parts of it and it doesn't do it for me yet. And I don't know that it has legs that will take it anywhere. But what it's doing is making people think differently about the text. Just like there's a group that's trying to write non-binary Hebrew, create language for non-binary Hebrew. Hebrew is binary. It's male, masculine, feminine. English has 3 tenses. It has neutral genders. It has neutral as well, neuter. We have it. Hebrew doesn't have it. So there is a group that's been working on how do you create Hebrew to be gender neutral. That's where you'll notice in Temple Beth Shalom now, we don't have bar bat mitzvahs anymore, right? We have B mitzvahs.
Oh.
I don't know if you noticed.
Yeah.
Because it used to be b'nai mitzvah. We used to talk about b'nai mitzvah, but b'nai is masculine. It's banim.
A note, yeah.
Well, no, but then it would be benot mitzvah.
Right.
But if you say b'nai, you're defaulting to masculine. Right? So B mitzvah just says it could be anything. Could be a trans child. Right? It's not male or female, it's trans. We have just trans. Or it could be any identification. It could be fluid. Right? So that little piece of these discussions has now infiltrated our synagogue, and you hardly notice it. Well, but to get there has been decade of discussions and work within various parts of the reform and conservative movements and reconstructionists and articles and things written and and now we have some language for at least that ceremony, right? And that's just one little tip of the iceberg, but an important one, because it allows us to say everyone can have this ceremony. And we don't have to think in binary terms about one of our most important ceremonies, right? So, there are some ceremonies that are going to be real tough. The Brit Milah, that's going to be a tough one. I'm not sure how you do it, but I don't know. For 40 years of my rabbinate or more, I never would have thought B mitzvah would be an answer. It never occurred to me or to any of my colleagues. So it takes time, but eventually there are solutions that are found if we keep working on it. So the whole Dear Shuni project is that kind of force that is helping drive this. And now there are men who are writing in the Dear Shuni style. And they're crediting Dear Shuni with that. So what we're starting to see is what women have always said. Our movement is not just for women. It's for all human beings. It is not just to make women equal. It is to make all humans equal and to see all humans as having value. Women are the biggest group, because that is over 50% of the world's population and the United States population and the Jewish population. And therefore, you start with that big wedge and you work on that. But then there are the other groups that have been sidelined over the years for various reasons, or have been maneuvered so they don't feel comfortable in the midst of our organizations. Any comments or questions?
So have you written a book review yet?
About what, Dear Shuni?
Uh-huh.
No, actually, one really wonderful book review was written by Jeff Salkin, Rabbi Jeff Salkin. Some of you may know him. He lives up in toward the north in I think it's Palm Beach County. He had a synagogue up there. He was at Solel for a while, I think for a few years, and then he retired. He was a rabbi in England in the major synagogue in London, and Jeff writes a blog called Martini Judaism. Martini Judaism. I guess he likes to drink martinis. And if you were to search Martini Judaism and look at his blog on Dear Shuni, he wrote a really clever and powerful statement about the book that I've shared with other people. It's I think he did an effective job in that. All I'm doing is teaching it in a number of places. I teach it at Temple Beth Shalom. I have a class in a condo down here in the Grove that's attended by a number of women. With Nancy Cohen, kind of convenes it. And I've taught it to actually the CCR board meeting. I taught a Dear Shuni text. So I'm trying to spread the word along with many other colleagues who believe that it's a very important text that needs to be shared. And now I shared it with you guys this year.
That would be good to teach us.
Right.
I'm interested.
Well, that's what I've been doing. So we'll see about next year. I'm not sure what I'll teach next year, but I did teach it also at one Torah 2 weeks in a row at Torah study when we happened to be, when I was asked to do those 2 weeks. So we'll see where we go with this, but it's been fun for me anyway to share it with you. And I hope you have a fuller view of Midrash and of not only Midrash, but specifically Dear Shuni. And that maybe you'll get the book and start reading some of it. And if you have questions when you read a Midrash, you can always shoot me an email. Don't text me. And, I'm not real good at text. In fact, I'm awful at text. And I'm not even so good about voicemail on my phone. I get to it, but often 3 or 4 days later. But I am pretty good about email. So that's where you can best reach me. So Laila Tov, Shalom al Yisrael. Let's keep working to get those hostages free. Well, some of us are still wearing our tags and still trying to do what we can to remind the world that the problem is Hamas and not Israel. There you go, Mark. That we need to keep reminding them. And by the way, I hope you'll support the temple effort this Saturday night, because we're buying a big bond, hopefully to give to Israel for this year, that will support Israel. The board at Naor, our organization of retired rabbis, just voted a $10,000 Israel bond that we'll be buying. So I think anything we can do to spread that word is really important. And the piece that what's it called, Karen, that you have on the WhatsApp group?
The Lovers of Zion.
Lovers of Zion, that I think Karen, you started, right?
Yeah.
Mark. So what do you have, over 100 people on that now?
Yeah, we have about 116. Yeah.
So that's a great place. People share all kinds of wonderful stories there. Let's keep Israel in mind always, particularly as there are still soldiers fighting and dying, hostages dying and living in tunnels and who knows where. So, Shalom al Yisrael, peace.
Thank you.
for Israel.
Please, Thank you very much.
Shabbat Shalom to everyone.
Shalom.
Bye-bye.
I'll let go.
Thanks, Craig.